and connect to Apple TV at the same time. Okay. Is that working, Cameron?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so welcome.
So it's actually, sorry, worth noting, this has been live streamed, but you can also watch it after the fact. So if something was glossed over a little bit too quickly for you, you can go back and have a look, and so forth.
Cool. Well, yeah, first of all, welcome. As Nam said, this is, I think, the first junior level Wellrailed, and I thought it would be a really cool thing to do. So I run Rails Girls Wellington along with Marion over there. That's us. And it's a lot of effort putting those events on, and they're quite intensive. And what I really want to do is have a lot more frequent, shorter events throughout the year, like tonight. So this is just a little test to see if it kind of works. Get some juniors in the room and get you all connected with some people who are already embedded within the community. So first of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what Rails Girls is, why we decided to do it, the things that went well. Also, I think it's important to note things that didn't go well and what we're trying to do about that, and what's next. So who here is familiar with Rails Girls, just so I don't rant on about it for ages? Okay, cool, for all of you. So it's an open source, non-profit learning platform and community. So it's a whole bunch of guides online. It was started in Finland and is now in over 160 cities in the world. Now, Finland is an awesome country. You might know of it because it's the birthplace of Linux, SSL, MySQL, Nokia, and Angry Birds. Gender equality sector. Why we decided to go with Rails Girls is, well, I work with Rails developers, so I thought, I've already got a community there to pull on, and there's a lot of momentum behind it already. There's a lot of resources online. The community is really vibrant, and Ruby is a nice language to start learning, and kind of a low barrier to entry. A little bit about why we personally run it is being involved in the community for a few years. We'd go to events and there'll be more people called James in the room than women. And nothing against people called James, of course. And just having diverse environments is really great. So we wanted to do what we could to foster that. How it went. So we ran one last year and one this year. First year we had 80 applications within 2 weeks. And of those, we were able to take 30 participants. And this year, we almost doubled that. We took 50 participants, and we had almost 100 applications. So there's still a lot of people sitting there in our wait list that really want to keep doing this. And we kind of have to think about how we're going to keep driving this forward together, because it is quite hard, and we need more support, really. Pros. The great thing about Rails Girls is that it helps to break some of those barriers to entry. Starting out in anything new is really difficult, especially when you're worried about being a minority in the group, or you're worried about self-judgment, or just a lot of people come up to me and said, I'm not ready to go to Rails Girls because I feel like I need to know something before I come, and it's really trying to break that down as this for complete beginners, and we're here to help you. The other pros are that there's tons and tons of resources online that's being built by the community, so we could easily just tell people to look at these tutorials. They exist, they've all been in trouble. All the troubleshooting's already happened. Some of the cons is that all the resources are only for beginners. There's a lot of information to be crammed into just one day. Trying to get complete beginners to have a Rails app on Heroku with comments and logins and all that kind of stuff in a day is a huge challenge. And the downfall of that is people come out, but they feel happy at first, like I've done this thing, but then they don't actually know why they typed these things in, or they couldn't understand really what they were doing. So how we tried to combat that was to add a second day to the course. So that was challenging in itself. We had to write a whole bunch of new material, but that was possible because we had awesome people in the community. So we had 3 new streams that we added. PowerShop ran a Ruby stream. Able Tech did a test-driven development stream, and Rabbit, who's well, not Matt anymore. Matt and Rob and Owen did a front-end stream, and Amy, who's also not around in Wellington anymore, she did a stream on GitHub. Yeah, so some of the challenges about making our own course and moving away from the standard outline was that we're making stuff up as we go. Less tested, things took longer than expected. There were some technical challenges. And the other thing is we allowed more experienced people like Rachel, who's about to speak, join. So she's someone who's been programming for over 10 years but doesn't know Ruby. And we're like, how can we make someone like Rachel learn something from a beginner's course? So we had that challenge of trying to not be condescending to those who know programming, but also not skip over heaps of stuff that'll make it difficult for newbies. Terry motives. Apart from taking over the world, Mary and I have some other reasons and some other things we want to do, and that's around breaking down more barriers. So we want to make this more accessible, and that means maybe providing some laptops for those who can't come, because currently to get into a lot of these courses and to get into the Rails skills, you need to bring your own laptop. So we're looking at ways that we can help with that, and also getting into schools. One of the women who turned up to the last Rails skills was a IT teacher at Wellington Girls College, and she's really keen to have the community come through the school and help get Ruby introduced, because currently I don't know what they're doing, but I think that she's going to teach them Python or something. Anyway, she's really keen on trying to connect Rails skills into schools as well. Okay, and that's my rant for now. Thanks for listening, and I'm going to pass you off to Rob now.
Sucker.
Oh, is that
Cool. Hello, I'm Rob. I work for EverTech. I'm on Twitter at Rob Ramsay instead. And today I'm going to talk about frameworks. What the hell are they? Of course, Rails is a framework, and I'm just going to try and explain essentially what that is, and also talk a little bit about how code loading works within Ruby, because you really need to understand that to get a sense of how Rails works as a framework. Cool, but before we do that, I think it's kind of easy to think about a framework as what they're not. And a framework is not a content management system. Probably most people here will be familiar with CMS systems like WordPress. This is what Wikipedia has to say about it. But for me, what a CMS really is a configuration system. It's something where you set it up and you do your work using configuration rather than writing your own code for it. They're generally optimized for simple content, things like pictures, videos, or text. And the structure is really kind of set in stone. It's something where you can't play, loose with the framework itself. This is kind of as opposed to a web application framework, which Ruby is. Again, this is what Wikipedia has to say about it. But for me, this is really just helper code. And the important thing about like a framework is that it's a collection of lots and lots of little helper functions which you're using to accomplish your work. So rather than by just configuring systems, you're writing code and you're patching things together. So in this case, the structure is kind of suggested rather than dictated. And you can kind of replace or circumvent bits, although generally that's a bad idea, but the option is there. And it's kind of one of the important differences to the content management system. Cool, so how does this actually work in Ruby on Rails? You might have heard people say that Rails is a model view controller system or an MVC framework. What that really means is that Rails is a collection of helper modules or functions which are implementing this kind of philosophy of a model view controller application. So rather than it being something you configure, you pull in the different components and then you make this make an application out of the different components using your own code to configure it. So the first part of this is the controller, which in Rails is action controller. And what that does is it makes decisions based on a request that's come in from the internet. So if someone wants to get a particular page, the controller will get this first, and the controller will decide how it's going to handle that. You know, is the user logged in? Are they an admin? Things like that. The next part of the Rails framework is the model, which in our case is active record, and this model will control access to the database. It has lots of helpful functions for dealing with data. And the last part of MVC is the view, and that will basically use the information that it's received in order to construct a page, and it sends that back out to the person on the internet who's requested something, or the robot. There's another part to the system which is not MVC, but I think is also really important, called routing. And what routing is doing is it's essentially controlling the flow of traffic around the system, so it will decide which parts of the system get which requests. There's actually a lot more stuff within Ruby on Rails, but these 4 components are the bits that you'll really be interacting with if you build Rails apps. So that's all cool, but you know, where does all of this Ruby code come from? Essentially, we're pulling in components to build our app. But these are kind of magically loaded from nowhere. If you've ever programmed Rails, you'll hear the phrase magic quite a bit. So what I'm going to try and do in the next section is just try and talk a little bit about how code is loaded within Ruby, and try and give you a sense of how Rails is actually constructing its components underneath. So the way Ruby loads code is using these load and require statements, and what that does is it essentially goes to a file on the file system and it reads that file and it understands the file. It's what we call parsing. So an example of this is if I have a file called Ruby times, that's declaring a variable in there. I can then load that file, and I suddenly have access to the variable. It's kind of been understood, and now my environment actually understands what was within the file. To see an example of this within, sorry, I'll go on to loading system code. So there's another important point about this where you can load system code which is hidden in the background. So in this case here, I'm working with a CSV file. And in order to do that, I'm going to pull in this CSV Ruby file using the require directive, and that gives me a nice CSV variable, which lets me do handy things like looping over the rows in the CSV and getting them in a format that I want. The important thing to kind of realize about this system loading is that this CSV.rb is actually kind of hidden in the background. It's in a location that you generally wouldn't see. But because it's in the right location, Ruby knows how to find it. So anywhere on your system, on the standard Ruby install, you can go in and just go require CSV, and with one line, get access to something which is hidden quite far away. So the idea that where something is located is a really handy thing to realize. Cool. The next part of the picture is inheriting code, and Ruby implements something called object-oriented programming. This is used really, really heavily within Rails. Most of what you do within Rails will be object-oriented. And essentially it's based around the idea of subclasses inheriting code from their parent classes. A good example is Volvo being a subclass of car. So if you stuck code on the car model, you can get to it within the Volvo model. It's a nice way of sharing code. A simple example here, we have a cat class which knows how to talk, and I've declared another class called Kelly. This class is inheriting from cat class. That little less than arrow is basically saying inherit from cat. And now that I've inherited from cat, when I create a Kelly, that Kelly can speak using words that came from the cat. Within Rails, a really typical example of where you'll see this sort of code sharing is within Active Record, the models part of the MVC. By inheriting so with kind of one little line, I've pulled in a whole lot of information which is being sucked out of a file, hidden in the background somewhere. That's really cool, but sometimes that breaks down because you can only ever inherit from one class, which kind of becomes a bit of a doozy. So there are a lot of instances where you will want to take in, within a single class, you want to get a lot of different sections of code from different places, and you do that by including and extending, which I'll show you here. So there's the include and the extend keywords within Ruby, and essentially what these do is they pull in code from elsewhere and they include it within your class. Include and extend actually do very similar things, but they work very differently. I'm not going to go into this. There's actually a bit of complexity around here, but really the important thing is this idea of sucking in code from somewhere else, including it. So a simple example here is I'm going to create a lion duck. And we have a lion module which knows how to roar and a duck which has a funny walk. I am going to use the include methods to pull these different code from the two different modules into the Kelly class, and when I create a Kelly, it can both roar and walk. If this was a class, I wouldn't have been able to do that because the class can only inherit from one thing. So I would have to explicitly create a lion duck rather than pulling from both. Cool. Within Rails, you probably won't run into extending or including very often. It's used very heavily internally. If you're creating a large code base and you need to organize your code, people tend to be very disciplined in doing this. They use these systems for essentially modularizing your code and organizing it very strongly. So it's used really, really heavily within Rails, but as someone who writes Rails apps, you probably won't see it too often. The one place you might run into it is if you're using external libraries. We call them gems. Sometimes these will install themselves into your application by using include or extend. One of the examples that I've seen is Pundit, which is a security gem. And this is providing an authorized method, which you can see down there. So by including it within our controller, then within the controllers of the system, we can use methods which were included within the Pundit module. Cool, so now that we've kind of gone through this long journey explaining how you include and extend and load files and do all of this magic, it kind of makes frameworks make a little bit more sense, I think. So we can have a file which can load other files if it needs to, so it knows what it needs to include, it will load or acquire them. It will then inherit or mix in the code that it needs. Digress. Mixin was including or extending. Often we'll call that mixing in because you're kind of mixing in code from somewhere else into your class. And once you understand how that works, you can think of a framework as like a system that will load your custom code and will then combine it with its own components and then runs it as one single thing to create a single web app using code from different places. Cool, thank you. Does anyone have any questions as well?
Good point.
I know I kind of moved along the clip.
The sequence sounds while I just slip through the
More than one.
Yeah.
And then while I log on as well, you can see lots of sounds doing that. Just a moment.
I feel like I'm 4 seconds.
Google's trying to.
You notice when you're like, oh,
Yeah.
like you just hear the little
What the old round play? No. Well, getting really irate.
You can stop talking amongst yourselves. Hi. My name's Rachel Collingwood. This is my first Wellrailed. Kelly told me that, on your first time you come, you need to present. So I'm looking forward, especially down back there, to see what you've got to say later on. So I am a Ruby on Rails developer in training. About 2 weeks ago, I started at PowerShop. Before that, I was a .NET developer at Frond for about 10 years. And for an undisclosed amount of years before that, I was a Visual Basic developer in the UK. So yeah, I think how I got to being in Microsoft stack and working there for a long time to being where I am now, that might be another talk, not that I'm volunteering. So I guess suffice to say that I've worked in the enterprise arena in .NET for quite a long time, and now in the last 2 weeks I've been doing some Ruby. So my balance of what I know about is a bit out. In fact, what I know about Ruby is pretty much based on writing a mastermind app that I'm doing at the moment. It's not quite what I was doing in .NET before. So anyway, I guess this is just a personal journey through what I was doing, what I'm doing now, and what I'm finding. So, and that way I can't be wrong because it is just from my my little worldview. So, things I'm enjoying using. I'm enjoying using the Rails console. If you're a Microsoft developer, you probably use in Visual Studio the immediate window, which lets you have a look at what's going on in your code, put a breakpoint on it, your code is built and compiled, you can analyze what's going on there. But you need to be running your application, so it needs to build to start with. It's not really a sandbox like this is. I can do some stuff like, I don't know, it might look like gobbledygook. It still sort of does to me, to be honest. So I'm in my little mastermind application. I've got a game object which I've written myself. I've done lots of testing. That's why I'm up to 75. So you can see there's some SQL going on there. That's pretty cool. That's just all happening.
what SQL?
Oh yeah. That's another talk. So I'm going to the database and I'm getting some stuff back there. So that's pretty cool. That's working for me. That wouldn't happen like that in .NET. I can just have a look and see what's going on with what I have loaded back from the database. I could test out my Ruby syntax. I do that quite a lot because I'm not sure that what I'm writing is going to be a thing or not. In .NET, I would know because I'd have some big red squiggles under my code. That's not a thing. It's not going to compile. I'm not going to be able to test it at all. So this has been really cool, especially for me right now. So I was using that a lot before I got into doing some proper sort of testing. Now it seems to me that obviously in Microsoft you can do, you've got MS test, yes you can write unit tests, but not everyone does. It's not really a fundamental part of what you do. Your project manager might not think, I sort of think it's a good idea you should be doing it, but when they see you spending a lot of time on it, I don't know, the value of unit testing isn't recognised as much. It seems to me that it's much more fundamental. That might be because the code is interpreted. There's no magic going on before it's loaded to check that what you put in there is even syntactically correct. the compiler in .NET does that for you. So you've probably got a good chance of things running in .NET and working sort of how you think. But I like this. I love this approach. I've been using RSpec. I've listed some stuff. Not really sure what all of that is. But I've been using RSpec, and I think that's fantastic that unit testing is just part of what you do. And I can also see the point of test-driven development a lot more. I can't write a test in .NET that says, okay, I want to use this class before I've written the class. I'm not going to be able to compile that. I can't find a class that doesn't exist. I can do that here. So it makes test-driven development sort of work. Speaking of RSpec, here's something amazing that I wrote to make sure that my little game was working. And this is less an example of testing itself, but more the fact that I really like the way that you use natural language a lot. I think I found before in Microsoft land we're trying to contract things and there's lots of abbreviations, and it makes sense at the time, but you come back in a little while and maybe not so much, or the other person who doesn't know the abbreviation, not so much. So it seems to me there's a lot of natural language. I've not been told off yet for making variable names too long. Hey, that might happen. Like I say, it's 2 weeks. But I like that. And then I sort of think you can just really read that. So
conversational is often how it's referred to.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of, we've got a subject, we're looking at the method I've written. There's a context. This makes sense if something fails. I know where it's failed because I've got my nice little message come out there. So yeah, I'm really liking that. There is obviously a Microsoft community. I think it's got more sharey in the last few years, but it hasn't really been sharey so much before. I've been to things like TechEd where you've got thousands of people there and you've got someone standing up and talking to a few hundred people, and they can't talk about the little things they're doing. They need to talk about the really big stuff because someone's just paid $3,000 to turn up to the event, and it's quite a different thing. I started a bit of an initiative where I was working before to have this sort of dialogue with people and people sharing, and that's going really well, but it seemed like quite a new concept. So I would say that that's something that I'm really liking, the whole community aspect. So things like sharing knowledge, mentoring, that's happening a lot. The cross-training and looking at the talent of a programmer over their skill. To get in the door for a .NET job, you need to be .NETed up to here. Whether you're actually adept at being a programmer is sort of neither here nor there, I think. I mean, that's what it seems like to me. Obviously, I'm a living example of being cross-trained right now. Maven is a term I really like because it's about being really good at something, but seeking to pass that information on. That's definitely what I'm finding about this community. People are, like this. People are really trying to get you involved. And those Wales girls, I went to that. That's what started this whole thing off. Thanks. I really like creating a project in Rails because that's what you do. And in .NET, I have to choose between that, and I don't know, that's an hour you'll never get back deciding what it is that you really want to do. We're getting to the small things now, but that's quite a marked difference there. There's lots of cool things I like about the language because it's all OO. I mean, I've got a number of guesses up there, but that could be the number 10 dot times. The code afterwards, it's going to happen 10 times. Do that in .NET. I just like it. I would have to do a little loop. Someone, maybe in this room, has told me the loops in Ruby, that's just a bad thing, and kittens will die, and that is now that is now the mentor. So I just try not to do that. Again, with the natural language, I've got a class. It's a guess. It belongs to a game. It belongs to it. That's really nice use of language. To me, it seems really obvious what's happening there. I really like zip, random things. Zip on an array, you've got a couple of arrays, maybe they're 5 elements each. You zip them, you merge like a zip, like people are supposed to do on a motorway. It works better. Motorways. So, and I like pluralize because that will stop your average developer from just coming up with something rubbish. And so, yeah, that's great. So that will say, if you've got one guess that you've done, it's going to say you've made 1 attempt. If you've got 27, it's going to say 27 attempts. That's genius. Right, and this gets its own slide because I like it so much. That's the unless keyword. I don't know what it is about having bang something that just makes my head go, when's the code underneath going to run? But saying that, unless a thing is true, go and do all this stuff. I really like that. You can tell I didn't like this in .NET because I put a .NET comment in it that doesn't understand it. Anyway, that's okay.
We tend to use very simple cases like that with unless.
Right.
Because if you start going unless this or this
Unless
or this
that.
and this,
Unless
it doesn't make
sense.
which I have
Mastermind.
seen somebody
Oh,
write,
really?
it
Yeah.
just completely does my head in.
Right. Maybe it's just
Yeah. But
just a little
it's all
thing.
about making it readable. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And for Mastermind, certainly. Actually, I'm not using it for Mastermind. I haven't really got much fingers broken going on there yet. I'm really enjoying using things like the command line and text editors and Macs because I'm feeling just a little bit more hardcore. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. So I've actually had a MacBook Air at home for a couple of years, put Parallels on and some Visual Studio, go me. So I've had a MacBook Air for a long time, which I've used. I had to do some IT support for my mum's Windows machine in the weekend, and that was a less than joyful experience. So I'm enjoying the sort of whole package. I think I've got an IntelliSense slide. I do miss it a little bit, but I'm feeling quite cool not using it. So in my good old .NET environment, I can take my... Oh, I know there's something like RubyMine and stuff, but I feel too uncool to go there yet.
If you use Sublime Text, gives you that would be nothing.
Yeah, but only if I've typed stuff before, doesn't it? Because I am using Sublime and I need to put it. It's not just going to go, hey, you're talking about or whatever, and I'll go and get all that fun stuff. Really? Okay. But I can't go there yet. I have to be hardcore with it.
Oh yeah.
Oh, maybe I'll get you up. But I don't know. Actually, I think it's brought some brain cells back into life. I have to remember some things and learning a few keyboard shortcuts. Yeah, it's all great. So that's the only little bit of like nostalgia. This is a quote from a totally random person on Stack Overflow, but I really liked it, so I put it there, and that's pretty much what I think too. So that's it from me. Maybe in 6 months I should come back and say what I really think. But I'm pretty happy for the moment. Oh, I know. Oh, God, another two. That's about like half a dozen I've just done. So if you get that. Oh, we can go and have pizza.
Well, we've got to applaud you first.
Oh, yes. Cheers.
Okay, cool. So we're going to have a medium-sized break while we have some pizza and chat amongst ourselves. Sorry?
What time do you reckon?
Gut feeling, see how loud the volume is. Why for the roles of people online? Glenn in particular, it turns out.
Cool. How did you find it at Met to get some experience?
Sorry.
Pretty similar experience, I guess.
I don't know.
Do you listen to ASICs, whatever it is?
Yeah, it's automatically cool. It's just some of the variables and things from your object that tells you.
Can you
Yeah, it's just screen sharing. So bring, and yeah, you should just be able to start a desktop might be a
Yeah, that's
option because if you go full screen,
yeah. That's working?
Yep.
Cool.
So yeah, you can background it with that.
And screen share. Whoa. Can you say my email?
can I just boot you off?
Too late.
Yeah.
If you're quick enough.
Am I still streaming?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So, my name is Megan. I work at Rabbit, doing mainly back-end web development with Ruby on Rails. So today I'm going to be talking to you about debugging. So what is debugging? It's the act of finding bugs or exceptions or defects in code and ripping them out, fixing them, however you want to describe it. It was popularized but not invented as a term by Grace Hopper when she found a literal bug in a machine. There was a moth in one of the mainframes at the military facility that she worked that was causing all sorts of glitches in the machine, and they enshrined this moth as a bug that they found. If you don't know who Grace Hopper is, she was possibly the first person to ever write a compiler, and also was the inventor of COBOL, for better or worse. So yeah, she's a pretty amazing figure in computer science history.
General in the Navy too.
Yeah, yes. No, Admiral. Admiral Grace Hopper. Yeah. So very impressive woman. So this may be obvious, but why do we need to debug? So machines do exactly what we tell them. There's no room for ambiguity. And at the end of the day, we're not perfect. We're not infallible. Even if we are perfect, as some of us are, some other person on your team or some third-party developer or your users, as they quite often are not perfect. So something is inevitably going to go wrong, and someone is going to be breathing down your neck to fix it. Whether that's the voice in your head or someone putting a bug on the bug tracker is, yeah. So what happens when we see this in our Rails app? Or maybe this from our trying to use our printer in Windows XP apparently. Or this, the dreaded blue screen. There's a few techniques, tools, and concepts that we can use to figure out what exactly went wrong, where it went wrong, and how we can fix it. So I'm going to talk about some of those, mostly focusing on Ruby and Rails, because it's well-railed after all. So at the simplest, you've got this thing called print debugging, where basically you don't have any better tools. You've got a console that you can output some text to, and you know something's broken, so you start putting little print statements or puts statements everywhere in your code to try and figure out where you are and where exactly it's breaking. These days it's only generally used in embedded systems where it's hard to get any better tools in there, so things like your microwave or refrigerator or whatever else they're putting chips into these days, your car. Because if that goes wrong, yeah, there's that happen. So it might look something like this. So we've just got a put statement here saying, you know, giving us a bit of context, we're about to do something bad, and this function doesn't actually exist. So we're never actually going to reach this next line, we're never going to get that output. So when it does break, down the bottom here, as you can see, it's printed that first line out, and it's exploded, so we know it never got past that. So evolving from that, because that's about as primitive as you can get, we have what are called stack traces. So instead of relying on trying to put a unique print or put statement everywhere in your code and doubling your lines of code and generally being a bad idea, you can use these things called stack traces, which tell you exactly where in the code that things broke. Gives you your line number, your function name, file name, what have you. Even like a full list of the functions that called it and where they are. So it provides a lot more context to us and allows us to know exactly why things blew up. So this is an example from Rails, from some code I was working on today for Pledge Me, if you've heard of Pledge Me. So as you can see here, it's actually blown up in the internal Rails gems in Action Pack. You can see that by the prefix there, Action Pack version 4.0.5, and there's its file that is blown up in the line number and the function name. We have to go down a bit, step back up the tree as such to find where in our code things have actually blown up. So here you can see an app helpers campaigns helper, line 36, in the function name campaign actions, things went slightly awry. It provided a bad parameter to a library function and things did not go very well. Continuing on from that is the concept of debug logs. So we're generally not monitoring our console output all the time to catch when things are blowing up. So we can come along later and have a look through our debug logs, which is collecting all these all the console output into a file for us. It's where you often find where the stack traces are. And in Rails projects, it can be found in the log folder in your project folder. You probably haven't generally looked at it, but in there you'll find things like development.log and test.log, and if you're on a production system, production.log. And as you expect, that's the development output and the test output and that sort of thing. Then we move on to interactive consoles. So this is a common feature with dynamic languages like Python, Ruby, Node.js, Perl, that sort of thing. Dynamic languages are languages where you're not actually compiling them. There isn't a step where you have to process the code to turn it into machine language. They're just compiled as they run. So this means you can just, the computer can run the code as you type it, making interactive consoles more easily made. So you can do things like run a statement at a time and change the parameters around, see what works, see what doesn't, see why exactly passing null to that function blows it up. And just as a good tool for learning in general. You've probably encountered it in Ruby as IRB, but Pry is a much better alternative in my opinion, which is an alternative provided through a gem. IRB is built into Ruby. And you most often encounter it through Rails by running Rails console. So that will give you an IRB with the context of your Rails application. And we move on to the magic of debuggers, which are, as implied by the name, one of the most important tools in your toolset. They allow us to set what are called breakpoints in code. So this can either be a statement, or if you're using an IDE like Visual Studio for .NET, it can be actually physically marking a line, as that's where you want the code to break. So that will, as the computer is running the code, when it hits that, it will pause the program and will drop you into a interactive console, as we saw earlier. We can then have a look at the state of the variables in the function. We can have a look at the overall state of the program. We can check whether things are in the appropriate state as they should be, things are going as they should. And we can also run more code to see if the next steps will actually succeed or not. In Ruby and Rails, it's provided by the debugger gem in Ruby versions less than 2. Unfortunately, in later versions, it's quite broken and they haven't got round to fixing it yet. So there's an alternative called bybug, which is a different gem. And it also, of course, has to use different keywords for its debugger standards. Oh, I was going to do a demo here. If it's going to, here we go. Okay, so if we have a look in this example code here, which I'll blow up for you. Okay. Can anyone remember how to zoom in Variable Plus? Yeah, I tried that.
It works. I'm going to do it a few times.
Yeah.
So, as you can see here, this is just a Rails scaffold. So this here is our debugger statement. Now this could be debugger if you're using the debugger gem, or bybug if you're using bybug. That depends. This is using something called pry bybug, which is integrating pry, the alternative to IRB, with bybug. So when it hits this, it will drop into pry rather than into IRB. So if we see this in action, if I can, maybe it helps if I look at the screen and navigate to the URL where it's going to pause. So as you can see, it's just spinning there because the program has stopped running. It's paused. And if we go into our terminal where it's running, and again, I'll blow it up for you. On the bottom here, can you all see that?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to drag it to the side at the top?
Straight bottom up.
Good idea. You can see here it's stopped at that particular line where we've set a breakpoint. So here we can actually see the state of our variables in the foos. We've got foo1 and foo2. And from here we can actually step to the next line. So either step or S. And we've moved on to the next line. And if we step again, we actually move outside the function because it's finished, and it moves up to what we called it. But we can still have a look at, well maybe not there, but you would have seen this state of foo change. So now we can continue, and that continues on, and the page loads.
You still have turbo links in there.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's a really powerful tool, but pretty simple in concept. So now there's some less common and some Ruby or Rails specific tools as opposed to general concepts. And this is where I get a bit fangirlish. and talk about this awesome tool called Raygun. So when we deploy our apps to our production system, quite often what happens is all the debug statements, all the verbose output gets turned off, and things like, while error logs may still be outputted, it's a bit more work to get at them. You can't just, when you go to a broken page, it will just say an error occurred, and you won't get any other context. The other alternative is that we might be working with a client that doesn't give us access to the machine, they control access to it, and so we can't get access to the logs. So this is where awesome tools like Raygun or Airbrake is an alternative. They allow us to keep track of errors that occur in production. So what happens is an error occurs and it sends off a little bit of JSON to Raygun servers, and they process that and turn it into pretty graphs and send out all sorts of alerts to you. And it includes the stack traces and also program state, so that can tell you who the current user who's experiencing the problem, the web browser they're using, the request parameters they provided, all sorts of useful information. Yeah, you can check them out at raygun.io. A very useful gem that I use is one called Better Errors. So the default Rails error page when you're in a development environment isn't actually that useful. Better Errors provides a better error page in your development environment. So it gives you your, what it calls frames here. So this is each thing in your stack trace, each function. So you can navigate between those and see what particular code's there, and it will actually give you the context there. So in your right-hand window here, you can use that like you would prior IRB. Down the bottom here, you can vaguely see it gives you the request parameters, the session variables, all sorts of stuff. So quite handy. And just to give you some things to think about in terms of like more advanced concepts that are kind of outside the scope of this. What happens when the code is not running on a machine? How do we debug that? It is possible, but it's more complicated. And looking at remote debugging probably will help you out. How do we debug code that isn't our own? So what if they're using different tools? What if they're using a different language? Can we still interop with that? And how do we debug when the code isn't available? It is certainly possible, but very much not easy, extremely technical, and requires a lot of knowledge about how computers work internally. And this is the difficulty of that. It's why open source is so important. It's something the Rails community kind of takes for granted a bit, but not something we think about necessarily. So yeah, that's that. Was there any questions? No? Cool. I was either really awesome or really over everyone's heads, or you're all terribly bored. I'm not sure.
I could use some stickers to go.
Oh yes, yes. Martin gave me some swag if you want some stickers. They're on the table here, so you can grab one.
I like Raygun too, but I hear they found the highest dark secrets beneath the data.
It's a dark secret.
Big quack.
The secret's not so secret now.
Oh, good shave away.
Just a shout out to those listening at home.
I'd like to be with me using a VGA cable and because I don't have an Apple machine and sharing my desktop. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? Not that. No, not really. My name is Max. I work at Enspiral. I am a developer for Enspiral Craftworks, where I do some contract work. But I'm also a developer for Wellrailed, which very briefly is an open source project about online decision making. It's really simple. The idea is people have conversations, someone puts up a proposal, and then people vote on it, and then they can modify their votes. And the iterable solution that is going to work for everyone, I believe. So, I'm using Wellrailed as a context to talk about internationalization, which is the process of making your app internationally accessible. Usually this means just translating it, I guess. So I'm talking about a translation gem called I18N. Otherwise it's very easy way to say it, but nobody say it. First, maybe a little bit about why translation is really important. For us, in our particular context of Lumia, it's really important because we believe one of our core values is accessibility. We want as many voices to be able to be part of decisions that affect them. And to do this, it means making the tool not a barrier to them engaging with the community. Yeah, so this is Lumio, this is the front page. Please be good. And that's it in Korean. And that's Google Translate being helpful. And so Korean's a supported language at the moment, and we've got Macedonian as of last night when, well, it's an experimental, so I'll get into that in a moment. So, I've got my sort of to-do list to cover. So, how it works. So basically, it's not that fancy. Like our setup is like as simple as it could be. Rails comes packaged with I18N, as in with translation support set up. And here's what the translations look like. Basically, is that big enough? Let's make it bigger, right? The big maybe. So error access denied translates into you do not have permission to do this. So you might want to use that in a lot of places in the app. An example, so on the front page, here's the front page. Here's a piece of code where you would call a translation key. T just stands for translate, and then front page link blog goes straight to, if your language is English, was it front underscore page? Okay, front page. Okay, great. This is what I should have prepared slides earlier. Blog, wasn't it? Yeah. Front page link blog is just surprisingly the word blog. So not very interesting. In practice, in English, what this means is you end up with slightly less readable code. One of the advantages in English is that if you do have something like an error message and you want to change it in lots of places, or a piece of repeated text, like you always want to have the word back on a page. It's really easy to have that abstracted out. And if you ever wanted to change it, as in go to the previous page or go home or something like that, you can just change it here. When it comes to translating this into Spanish, they get exactly the same pink text, or keys, that is. The lookup values stay the same, but then the translated text is different. So that's pretty straightforward. So sorry, I didn't mention that this is what's called a YAML file. It's just a way of organizing a bunch of keys, like lookup values, and the indenting is nesting, as in this value here. To look it up, you would say ES, as in Spanish, try it, header, and then that would give you that value. Okay.
Format through, like, if you don't provide Spanish for the code.
Yeah, good question. So one of the features of Rails is you can, in the app, in the application controller, you can set the on any request you can set whatever the language is of the user. Set application level locale is just a broad before filter. Or if there's a user signed in, you can just grab their setting and plug that in. And that means that you don't ever have to put ES on the front, and it just will go and look up the appropriate language for that user. If there doesn't happen to be a key for Spanish, because the Spanish translation isn't finished, it will fall back to a default, usually English in this case. Okay, so how it works. So that's a simple case of translation. There are a lot of other cases which are more complicated. Where you might want to reuse the same sort of sentence, but, so for example, this one here, message placeholder, write a message to the member of which group. So you'll see there's some code-like looking stuff in here. What that does, enables us to do is something called interpolation, which means take that general pattern, but insert a specific piece of text within that. And so when you call that in the code, you just call the normal key, so it would be English dot something, or in this case, en.message placeholder. And then you just go comma, and then you define what which group is going to be. So which group could be mixes flat warning, or Rails Girls 2014 or something. And then when it prints that out on the screen, it will just like interpolate that, chuck it in. So those are basically the two functions of R18N. There are a few like other tricksy things, but yeah. So we've already covered set default locale. So I want to talk a little bit about what our workflow is, like how this has been so powerful for Lumio, and how it's enabled us to like translate our app pretty much into 24 languages maybe now. So we're using this tool called Transifex, which is free for open source projects, and the user interface looks like this. So the user doesn't see any of that pink text. All they see is a copy of the English key. So they click on it, they're like, oh, I want to translate this one today. And they're like, oh, here's the English, and there's what it is in Spanish. And I could disagree with this user and change this if I wanted to. Save, review. And then they go on to the next one. So Transifex is really user-friendly. You can just find translations which haven't been completed and work your way through them. And then at our end at Lumio, once the like periodically we will just go through and download the YAML files. So download these files, or the foreign language versions. and just load those into the app, and they're ready to go pretty much.
So sorry, did that just hook into your GitHub?
Yeah, so there is a little bit of trickery. So I'm over here at GitHub and so there's the master language as set up by, for our particular app is English. And so Transifex over here says, can I have your master file? And so periodically it syncs, it grabs a copy of the English file. And then the translators go, oh, there are some new keys, some new strings to translate. Welcome to Lingo, or we are crowdfunding, or whatever. Then they translate them. And then the final step is we download them again and stick them into the app. We stick all the front ones in.
They don't automatically commit it back to your code base?
No, not at this stage.
Is it professional translators, or is it just...
No, this is open source.
Right. Is it featured? Can I go on there and go, ha ha ha?
Yeah, you can, yeah, totally. So that isn't something that we're totally running like minimum test set up on this. Generally, the people that come in and want to be translating actually care quite a lot about community, so we haven't had any complaints like this is really offensive. Have you seen what they've translated yet? That day probably will come, but we'll build for it when it happens probably. So here are the
Sorry, one question. Is it
yeah,
open
go.
source only? Is it like businesses use it?
Transifex, yeah.
Yeah.
So you can, it's kind of a little bit like GitHub in that you can pay for a private translation sort of repository. Yeah. And it's got other useful features like we recently did do a crowdfunding campaign. We did want what we said to be really reliable. It was possible to say, okay, here's a chunk of, here's the video that we want translated, and you can go in here and go order translations from professional translators, and there are like different brackets, like here's the cheap translation, here's the more expensive, you know, like the 1,000 words, whatever. It's got a few things which I would change, but on the whole, this is an amazing tool. You can see all of the languages are at different states. They all tend to decay because our language is continuously evolving.
I think there used to be a gem called Translate. I don't know if it's not been upgraded or anything, but it does a similar process. It's not as nice, but it does the same process, and you can do that, add it as a development gem, and do your translation in local development. So perhaps there's
So this is powerful because you don't need a development environment. You can, it's Transifex that's completely separate.
You can actually set it up in production. Say you set up a staging server somewhere, and you could have single password on the whole site. But I was also going to make a point that even if you're doing single language sites, it's useful to use this if you expect your text to change often, because you can essentially give one file of the translations to a non-developer and sort of give them an orientation. They can change it. You can take that change back. And it doesn't have, they don't have to touch the source code of the views or the controller.
It's a little bit like CSS for language, kind of. Like abstracting it a little bit out gives you a lot more control.
Do you have any kind of handle around messages changing size? Like one word in English becomes like 100 Spanish words maybe, and like, well, this is destroyed my page.
Yeah, there is some wordflow stuff, mainly on the front page, that we worry about that.
Doesn't most of stuff using different view files for different languages?
I haven't exposed that yet.
Asian languages are shorter and fuller, essentially.
Yeah.
And then there's also languages that are right to left.
Right to left, yeah. Okay, so you're exploring all of the gotchas, which I was going to go through. Which is great, you're thinking ahead of me, that's great. Right to left is one problem. Another problem in a similar vein is different grammar. So is it, I've forgotten, like verb, noun, object, noun, verb, object, or some combination. And then how do you do that with translation? Because especially when interpolation comes in, like Mix invited you to join Rails Girls, might in Japanese come out as Rails Girls, Mix invited you. So interpolating can get complicated, especially when you're like putting dates or, yeah, it gets a bit weird. So our workflow is we pull in language files from Transifex, I think that's where we got to, and then we've just got a master list of languages which, so we, by default at the moment, we actually just pull in all of the files, and then we just have a list of languages which are approved to be live, and so these are the selectable languages or detect. And then there's these other experimental ones. So you saw me activate the front page in Macedonian. You can only do that through typing special codes or params in the address bar. But that's just so people can see their work in situ, see how it looks, or because sometimes the context, it helps to have context.
So you assume that people wouldn't want to go back and forth between, if somebody's bilingual and they want to, I've done a project where we've done crowdsourcing on the site, that the content, crowdsourcing of the translations, but for the content, not for the UI, which is another issue.
That's another thing, yeah.
That the people doing the translation might want to switch locales, and that simply is just changing the URL, but having, I guess, so you're saying you only can do it by doing URL surgery.
When it's an experimental phase,
right?
But I mean, like, there's a drop down where you can say, like, right at the bottom of on the footer of every page, we can go Macedonian once it's live, as one of these like main supported languages.
Okay.
Does that also support the header, except in NZ, does it actually be header that provides languages and?
There's the before filter does a few smart things. It checks if there's a current logged in user in our context. If it is a user and they have selected a language option, then it uses their language option and ignores the header. If they haven't selected a language, then it reads the header and then tries to make an educated guess, which is like a little bit messy sometimes. Yeah. Some tips. I guess kind of like everything, having good keys is going to make your life a lot easier. It's going to make your code more readable. There's a little bit more to just saying good keys, as in like choose good pink text that makes sense. 18N has some like fancy stuff where you can actually leave off a bunch of the keys. So like if it was in we didn't know this when we started building it, but if you're on a page and it happens to be a warning page, like the view is, like lumio.org/warning/ and then you're on that page, you can leave off a bunch of the key, and it will deduce based on which view you're in, which key that you're looking for.
So yeah, you just start the key with dot and then the last segment.
Yeah. Tips, interpolation. I don't know what I was going to say about that. Fallbacks. There's a good. I'm not going to go into it, but there's a nice function where you can, if you do want to change your code at some stage. Sometimes if you change a translation or you delete a translation because of delays in translation across languages, like English is obviously up to date. Spanish is, we've got like a dedicated translator, but we're not paying one for Macedonian, we don't have someone who's really into that right now. You can say, you can define a fallback. You can say, here's the preferred translation, if not, fallback to this one. So that's nice to know about. You can put HTML inside of these values, these translation values. Like if I wanted to make this bold or something, scroll. You can do that. By default, R18 is smart and will print that as a string because you don't want translators inserting JavaScript or anything like that. But you can tell R18 that it's HTML safe basically by putting that on the key. That's
I might
useful
just
thing to know
sit
about.
in translation tool and say, oh, they've got underscore HTML and they have to use some JavaScript.
Sorry, say it again?
It's sanitized, right? Still?
Yeah, I don't think so.
No.
So you could put underscore HTML on one of the paint things, upload it to the translation website. Someone else there would see the key as. Do they see the keys?
They can look for the keys, yeah.
Right, so they'd say, oh, that's got underscore HTML on it.
Yeah. So this,
I'll put some.
every 24 hours or whatever, it pulls the English, the current thing from GitHub, which, unless you're a contributor to Lumia project or you've got sort of merge permissions, then it's not going to get into the master English translation file. So it won't be able to get over to TransFX.
So someone can figure out, though.
Yeah, you can look through. I mean, there are probably some keys that you could have used. So these are tips, like things to know, and this is kind of a gotcha as well. Like, just glance over the translations, make sure there's no JavaScript.
So what you're saying is don't just accept something from some place on the internet.
Yeah. Look at your pull requests. Yeah.
Whatever language.
So gotchas, interpolation keys. It's really problematic if you go and change your interpolation keys, because if I change in English this this interpolation key, the code, the app is going to look for, when it loads up that string, it's going to say, hey, I've got the linked text that you wanted me to put in there as a variable. I'm just going to interpolate it, inject it. But then, like when we go over to Spanish, if the interpolation key is different, as if it hasn't been updated, it's still this, the app will go, give me the Spanish translation. I will insert the key now, like the interpolation variable now, and it'll be like, where am I inserting it? And it just breaks the app. Like IATN doesn't have a good way to deal with that. It just goes, and then like throws a bunch of errors, and the page is like a horrible experience. The user doesn't see anything. So that's something to know about. It breaks translations. You just need to be careful about changing your translations for similar reasons. Another gotcha is that different languages treat numbers and counting differently. An example is Indonesian. Rails has this really cool, smart thing where, so here's an example of interpolation. You've just invited a number of users, count some number, to join your group on Lumia, and you get this email or this message pop up saying you've successfully invited count users. In English, there are two entries here. There's one or other, and IATN is smart in that it goes, oh, the number count is 1, so then we will use the singular sort of translation. And if it's more than 1, then we use other, which is the many version. Some languages like Indonesian and Vietnamese and a number of others, there's no difference. Other is the same as 1. There's no plural or singular. It's just like 1 banana, 2 banana, 3. That's maybe a good example. But you can't say 5 bananas in Indonesian. It's just always 5 banana or 5 invitation. So this will also break the app, so you need to watch out for that. And TransFX doesn't, like if you have the one key missing, if you don't have this here, it's gone. If you don't have this here, it'll kill the app. So it's gotcha. There's a workaround for that. I'm going to move on though.
So you're using the workaround? Because I don't see one key and one other.
Yeah, it's hidden over here.
Okay, that's fine.
So
hang on, are you pointing out something that's completely broken?
There's probably a nicer way of doing this, but I've just got all the one keys over here in another file. So as long as it's got the same sort of structure, it will just like weave these in and it's trying to read everything.
Well, zips.
Huh?
It zips.
It zips, pretty much zips, yeah. One mini, other notes. So there was a question about so downloading all the YAML files from TransFX was a drag. They've got a nice API. So here's my, like I wrote a little rake file which just goes like, get all the like, yo, transifex, how many languages do you have? This many. And then it's like,
Oh my god, yo.
yeah, give me the languages. And then so it goes, and I color. Yeah, maybe. Colorizers, yeah, nice. And there are, each language has, at the moment, 2 language files. There's one separately for the front page to keep that isolated, and one for the main body of the app. I'd advise doing that, and maybe doing that even further, because it means your core functionality can be separate from your sort of like baggage, nice help text, for example, or proper text, yeah. So that that's a nice rake file. I also wrote one recently as well, and I just broke the code so that I could demo this. I went and like broke a translation. So here's an example of a translator who is just, they either haven't understood interpolation and the importance of it, or they have understood it, but it's just a typo. And I've just got it cycling through all the translations, comparing English and, in this case, Spanish. And it's highlighted that this space is going to kill the app, and it's just some regex, blah, blah, blah. And then I've made this like nice thing where you can just link directly to transifex, find the offending translation, and just fix it. Yeah. So there are little things that can make managing this kind of clunky system a little bit easier.
Yeah, I was wondering about running automated tests with a particular for each locale submitted, and that way you catch them before they go.
Yep. So this is something else. We've got Travis running tests on Lumio, but we don't have it doing per locale.
Right. Yeah. Seems like it would.
Probably a good idea. But again, like, haven't got to it yet.
Yeah.
Have you found problems with it? Or is that something that's not really caused issues?
Occasionally. I mean, occasionally we'll just get an error email, which is like, production will be like, the front page just broke, and then you just go, oh, okay, quickly fix. And we're kind of at a stage of growth where we can kind of sustain that, especially if it's in a market that we're still developing and it's enthusiasts.
And yet some kind of error notification service.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, that's pretty good. Your site is broken, it's down for Spanish, all of that. Yeah.
One thing I want to kind of interject with it, I've been investigating this and haven't got that far with it yet, but I saw an article where they caught the exception if the key was missing, and there's a way to then dump that into a YAML file. So you have a separate file with things that are missing. And if you extend that to include CI, you then have basically a file on CI that, you know, your entire app's been tapped, and it's telling you what you're missing out of in which particular language.
Yeah, totally.
So I will link to that when I find it again.
Don't you just puzzle the DLP file instead of it? You've got the T and some stuff after it, and then look up the...
Yeah, if you do the shorthand trick of not using the full key, it starts being real difficult.
Yeah, so this is where I'm gonna go through some existing solutions which kind of cover that. They're sort of like aside to this talk. There are 2 gems that might be worth a look. One is I18 in tasks. My computer's just run out of battery. One of them is I18 in tasks, and that has a bunch of like rake-like tasks which automate that sort of thing. Like, you've got missing keys, or these keys aren't used anymore. Why don't you still translate them? Just really useful stuff like that. And the open source community is rad. Like, exactly the same problem. Like, there are different ways to call translation. So T or translate or I18.T. in different contexts with emails. It gets a little bit complicated sometimes. And I said, like, hey, we're using symbols as our keys instead of strings. Can you? And it was just like instantly done. So
is it worth doing that for the symbols? Just on a side note?
I think so. I'm not sure I haven't done. So 18 in tasks. There's another one which is called 18 in viz. I think computer's gone. Which will let you, in a development environment, it just inserts JavaScript everywhere, and then you can hover over a particular piece of text and it will give you a tooltip which says this is the key that you are looking for. So it makes looking things up in the back end easier. In the last 2 days, Transifex has just brought out a beta product called Transifex Live, which is just completely JavaScript. You just put this one line of JavaScript in your site, and it allows like live translating of your site, and you don't have to deal with any of this YAML stuff. So that'll be really interesting to play with and see how robust that is. This is just one solution. It's really simple, quite accessible. You can go down like a database route. There are advantages and disadvantages of that. There are PO files and POP files. I don't know what they are, and MO files. Not sure. I started reading and was like, nah. Yeah. So that's basically it. Any questions?
The old Unix way out there, there are files and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I don't know.
One thing that's really worth mentioning is that I18N is an old programmer trick where if a word is far too long to pronounce all the time or to write down, you put the beginning letter, the end letter, and then the number of letters in between. So that's what I18N means.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, internationalization.
Internationalization, yeah. It's like,
Sounds similar. So the
Yeah.
programmers are lazy.
accessibility is sometimes a something Y, a reason why.
Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, cool. Which is
In a grant.
obviously not accessible. So. Yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions or amendments?
Has anyone tried to make a better internationalization framework on top of this?
Probably.
Good answer.
Not that I know of. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't done a lot of research.
Oh, okay, not great.
Because it's the stem like the country right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's good enough.
And the docs say like this is literally the simplest we could build it. Like.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's all. Thank you for our 5 presenters tonight. We're going to try and do a few more of these sort of junior ones, but as I said, you're quite welcome to come along to the other events as well. When was that? 15th?
15th.
17th. 15th. Get there eventually.
15th was, yeah.
Right. Of next month, it'll be here. So the same general format. We're working talks and stuff, focusing on optimization. Cool. Thank you for coming on.
We're going to head down to Southern Cross.
Cool.
Come on.
Come hang out and talk.